I'm really pleased tonight to introduce Dr. Christy McCain. Christy has a dual appointment at the University of Colorado. She is the curator of vertebrates at the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History, and she's an associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. So the inside scoop is that people who have this kind of dual appointment each department expects a full-time person. So she really has a lot going on here, trying to manage two different jobs, related to her interests, obviously. She came to CU in 2008, and that same year started the McCain Mountain Lab, which uses mountains and elevational gradients to study biodiversity, ecology, and some of the things that we're going to hear about. Her interests include species distribution patterns, abundance, diversity, and what causes the patterns that we see. Her current work, at least that I know about, there may be other aspects, focuses on carrion beetles and on Wyoming ground squirrels. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Christy, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
I will just remind everybody that, as usual, we're happy to have sort of on-topic chat in the chat box. If you think of a question as you go ahead and pop it into the chat window, and we'll know so you don't forget it and so that we know to catch it later. Thanks. Go ahead, Christy.
Great. Thank you both for the invitation as well as the introduction. So I am going to share my screen here so you can see some images other than just me. All right, so there we go. Hopefully you can all see that. All right, I'm going to close some of these little images. There we go. Okay, so I'm also going to make me small. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some research that we had come out about climate change impacts on small mammals in the Colorado Rockies. So here in this picture, you can see part of the San Juan Mountains and some of the mammals that we studied here in the San Juans and in the Front Range. And so I know a lot of you are birders, but you probably also seen a lot of these mammals that I will talk about today. So the question I'm asking, or I posed several years ago now, is, and that we've been collecting data on for more than a decade, is how are mammals responding to climate change here in our Colorado Rockies? But I thought some of you might be interested in who I am in the first place and how did I get here. And so I give a few slides here just about me and why I study mountains. And so I grew up near the Sierra Nevada mountains in California and did a lot of skiing and fishing and outdoor hiking with my family. And so early on, I had a love for the mountains. And then after graduate school, I did the Peace Corps for 2.5 years in Honduras. So in Central America, where I worked in national parks around the country, work with their wildlife people. And so I worked in this area, the Sierra de Galta, as well as the lowland tropical rainforest, the Rio Platino Biosphere Reserve. And then I also did my PhD after I got done with the Peace Corps, and I did my research in the Tiburon mountain range, which incorporates Monteverde, if you've been up there. So for the birders among you, not only did I see amazing mammals in these places, I saw really, really amazing birds as well. So this is where I started studying how organisms change their distributions on mountains. And so, sorry, I was just muting. So yeah, and in this time, right, so I graduated from university in undergrad, 1994. And about, in the next 10 years was when people really realized that climate change was a thing, and it was in fact impacting organisms around the world. And so when I took a postdoc, my second postdoc, first I was in Santa Barbara and then in New Mexico. And when I was in New Mexico, I realized I really wanted to study the Colorado Rockies because they have the highest elevations in the lower 48. And so in 2007, I started studying these mammal populations along elevational gradients in the San Juan Mountains, right? So this is in the southwest corner of Colorado and is amazingly beautiful. If you haven't been down there, you have to make a trip. And so the question essentially that I started asking with these data was, you know, these mammals that we see in our hikes, how are they affected by warming temperatures that they're experiencing, not just in the summers, but also in the winters when many of them are either hibernating or active under the snow. So, of course, probably everybody on this call knows that humans are changing our planet's climate, right? So you can see this in many different ways. You can see this here, a historical picture of a mountain glacier, and then the distribution of that glacier today. So 1932 to 1999, which would be probably even smaller today. But temperatures have warmed globally. That's what this red areas are showing here. But precipitation has changed quite a bit as well, and is predicted to change quite drastically. So overall, the global temperatures have gone up by 1 or 2 degrees, right? This has been caused by humans, right? It's our global carbon emissions, oil, gas, coal, cement plants. And of course, this has been linked to our industrialization, right? And it's, you know, a huge amount is the US here in this blue part, right? So we're contributing a huge amount to changing our climate. So Colorado, this is our temperature change, right? And remember, things go up and down around an average here, and you can see temperature here. Indeed, in Colorado is warming as well. So just to bring this home, I have a little video to show you. This is a NASA video where they've compiled temperatures from the 1880s to about, I think it goes up to 2020. So what I want you to notice as this video goes through is that each year it just shows you the anomaly. So that's what's the average temperature. If it's a little cooler, then it's going to be a little darker blue. White would be just the average. And if it's a little warmer, it would be in yellow. If it's a lot warmer, it's in red. So in normal times, without humans changing the climate, you would expect, you know, a little warming here, a little cooler here, there, you know, around the average over time. But I want you to notice in about 1980, you're going to start to see the significant impact of humans on our climate. So I'll play this for you. Hopefully it translates okay. All right, here we go. All right, so a little cooler, a little warmer, mostly around light blue averages. Oh, this year it got a little warmer in the Arctic. Then it got cooler again. Ups and downs. All right, now we hit the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Right, so here we are today. This is how much it's warmer in areas of the globe than it was from average historically. So you can see that here in Colorado, it's warmer, and at high latitudes, it's considerably warmer in other areas as well. So the question I'm asking today is, how does that influence the mammals that live in these places? All right, so one more figure about climate. So the idea is, okay, well, some people might ask, well, yeah, it's getting a little warmer, but it's been that warm in the past. Well, that's true. It has been this warm in the past, but the change has happened in just decades, whereas that change happened over millions or thousands of years. So that's what this little figure is showing you. So this big part here is millions of years. These are 5 million year increments. You can see that in the early part of the current area, right after the Cretaceous, right? It was really a warm world. It got cooler. And then we had the Pleistocene, right? Where things got warmer and colder, but this is at 1,000-year increments. Here we're showing 5,000 increments. And then here we're in, decades. So that's the big difference of what we're talking about today. When temperature changed over evolutionary time, that was happening at a very, very small pace, right? So over thousands and thousands of years, you would have a temperature change of 1 degree, whereas we're doing that over a couple decades. So the animals and plants just have a lot less time to react and to adapt than they did evolutionarily. Well, why would we even care about climate? Well, the bottom line is that organisms have a niche, right? They have a place in the world that they have evolved to live in, right? And climate is a very large predictor of where and is incorporated into where that species lives and reproduces, and that's their niche. And so that includes a particular temperature range, a particular precipitation range, particular type of habitats that live in that temperature and precipitation range, also what food resources are available, but also things that negatively impact them, like predators or diseases. So they've evolved to live in this particular niche that is incorporated by climate. And so when climate changes, the animals and plants have to respond somehow. So they can either shift their range, they can stay put and adapt, they can stay put and go extinct or locally extirpated. So those are essentially their options, right? Or they can move, and shift to track their niche. So keep in mind today, we're going to talk about climate change, mostly temperature change. But remember, this is also happening in a backdrop of other human changes to organisms' environments. So we have large-scale deforestation, and then we have human habitation. So a lot of land use change. And we'll come back to this during the talk as well. Okay, so to get to the nitty-gritty, what I asked was, how are mammals in the Colorado Rockies responding to these warming temperatures? And I started this study in 2007, quite a while ago. And we've been working on it for a long time because you need a lot of data to actually ascertain robustly whether things are responding as you might predict. All right, well, how do you tell if a mammal in particular is responding to climate change? Well, the ideal way to do that might be to track each population of each species over time, right? So in this case, here's the moose population in Isle Royale, Michigan, and you can see it's gone up and down, and it's quite low recently. So you might also look at the gray fox population. This is from California, or lemming populations over time. And here's from Alaska. But so you might want to do this for every population and every species, but we just don't have the time and money to do that for everything. So for instance, there's over 100 species of mammals in Colorado. Most of them have very large ranges. So just to give you an idea, here's 3 ranges, 3 different shades of gray. Those are 3 different prairie dog species in Colorado, and then populations across all of those grade areas. So if we had tried to track every population of every species, even in those 3, it'd be impossible. But then when you include all of Colorado's mammals, it's even more difficult. So the way that we did this was to compare a historical data set about distributions and populations to a contemporary data set. So, and that's where we trapped a lot of mammals, and we compared it to historically trapped mammals across Colorado. And what we used was museum collections. So as Karen mentioned, I and the curator of vertebrates in the Natural History Museum here at CU. And here's my collection manager, Emily Breaker, who some of you might know. She is a very big birder in Boulder. So we have collections of mammals from about 1830s on to today. We also have collections of birds, right? So birds all through the US, Colorado, but worldwide, as well as for mammals, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. And this is an amazing stock of knowledge about historical distributions and current distributions. And so we leverage that data to learn where every species of the mammals that we studied lived on these mountain ranges elevationally before the 1980s. And so that's what we called pre-climate change. And then we built a contemporary data set where we went out and trapped mammals all through the Front Range and the San Juan Mountains. And we used current collecting records in museums and in the literature for post-climate change, which is about 2005 on is what we compared. All right, so what are our predictions? Well, as all of you, I'm sure here know well from experience, is that it's warmer at the bottom of the mountain, and as you climb up to higher elevations, it gets cooler. And organisms experience the same thing. And so say a mammal that lives at mid elevations, so here in the Front Range, say in the foothills to mid elevations, this is its elevational range on the mountain, say in green. We would predict that if it was to shift upward with warming, it would shift to cooler elevations to stay within the same niche, right? So if it's getting warmer in their historical range, they're going to shift a little bit higher to track where their original range was in temperatures. So we would call that a shift up in elevation. Another mammal, like say the yellow-bellied marmot, might have a really large elevational range from mid elevations to the top of the mountain, but with warming, it might contract just to the very highest elevations. So that's what we would call a contracting elevational range. So those are the things we would predict with warming temperatures, that things would shift up or contract up in elevation. So who did we study? We studied, so the ones you probably know really well are the ground squirrels here. So yellow-bellied marmots, golden mantle ground squirrels, rock squirrels, various desert ground squirrels. We studied 2 tree squirrels, surely you have seen. The pine squirrel and Abert squirrel, 4 species of chipmunk. Of course, they all look very, very much alike. 7 species of voles, and the vast majority of what we studied, 13 species of small mice like Peromyscus truei here in the southwest. And here is Zapus princeps, the western jumping mouse, and then 4 species of shrews, which are also some of my most favorite mammals. So those are the species we were studying. We gathered a historical data set about each species and their elevational ranges, and then we resurveyed elevations to see where they live today. And we did this mostly on 4 elevational gradients. So here is the Front Range, Boulder, and then Loveland, and then these elevations all the way up to Rocky Mountain National Park or to Niwot Ridge. And then here in the southwest corner of the state in the San Juans, from nearly the 4 corners up into Lizard Head Wilderness and Sheep's Head Mountain. So those are the main sites we worked at, but we had a lot more sites, including Mesa Verde National Park, other parks all and protected areas all through here. So overall, the sampling we could talk about for a long time, but this is our overall sampling of both of those regions. So contemporary sampling in the stars, and then the circles are historical places that were sampled. So we had a lot of locations and a lot of known specimen localities. So overall, the historical data was all from museums, but not just our museum in Colorado, but we contacted museums all across the US that may have had Colorado specimens. And so overall, that database is about 55,000 specimens of mammals from Colorado. But for the species that we were interested in studying that had really strong locality data that we georeferenced, we used 4,600 specimens. And then contemporarily, we did a lot of trapping across many different years. And then we also used specimen data from museums. And so that was quite a few records as well. So the overall take-home message here is that, in fact, mammals are shifting their ranges, and they're shifting upward. So this is the overall. So first, just look at these two maps above. This is a composite of the net change in ranges. So this is a percent gain. So how much did they move up, and where did they move to in elevation? And then where did they lose elevation? So and then it was compiled. So we had 47 species across both mountains. And so if more species on average shifted their ranges away from some elevation, it's in red. And if they gained elevation, it's in blue. So you can see overall, this is the front range, that at the lower elevations, the lowest in the foothills, but even in the higher mid elevations, that species were being lost in their ranges. And where they were gathering extra range was just at the very, very highest elevations up here. And you can see that a little bit better here in the front, in the San Juans, where there's actually huge amounts of high elevation that they moved into. So again, the warmer colors, they lost range, and that they moved into these higher elevations. So to see that kind of in a histogram, on our x-axis here is each mountain's elevational profile from low to high, and then the gains and losses. So the gains are shown in blue, and you can see that their most gains are at the higher elevations, and then losses of ranges are in the red. And you can see across the San Juans, it's pretty much everywhere, but not, just a little bit in all elevations. That's true across the front range as well, but not as many losses at the upper high elevations. But remember, every species has a little bit different elevational range, and so their lower part that's getting clipped off could be at any elevation, and then their upper elevations are getting added to. So that's overall what we found, is that indeed mammals in Colorado are shifting higher with warmer temperatures. The average shift across all species that we tested was upward by about 131 meters. So as you've seen, I use meters here, but in feet, that's about 430 feet, which is a substantial amount of change. So if you expect about a degree of temperature change in 100 years, you would expect about 100 meters in elevational change. So this is a little over that. All right, so what does that look like? So here, this complicated figure, but essentially all these names are abbreviations of each species. So birders, right, know this by the first two letters and the last two letters, but we needed a few more letters to be able to differentiate the mammals, but that's essentially their scientific names abbreviated, and then on the x-axis on each mountain, and then again elevation on the y-axis, and then the different colors I'll go through. But the black lines here are their historical elevational ranges in all cases, and then the paired line next to it is the change that that species has shown on their elevational gradient contemporarily. So all the blues are showing upward elevation or contractions or shifts. So 26 mammals, or expanding upward, 26 mammals move to higher elevations across the two mountains. And I want to point these out in particular because these are the ones that are showing the most worrying responses to climate change. So these are predominantly montane mammals that are occurring at mid to high elevations and not always at the bottom. And so montane mammals, so those already living at mid to high elevations historically, 75% of them moved to higher elevations, and their average range shift was a lot bigger than the average across all species. So about 350 meters higher, which is almost 1,100 feet elevational shift. So this is substantial. And here's just some of those species that are alpine or mid-elevation to high elevation species that shifted significantly upward. All right, 6 species did not shift their ranges at all compared to historical data. These are some shrews, some squirrels, and some voles. And then 11 species either shifted downwards, so stayed at the same elevation and shifted to a little bit lower elevations, or contracted or expanded a little bit lower. So these are the outliers. These are the species we would not expect to have responded that way, but you can see a lot of those are low elevation specialists. All right, and then there's 4 I want to point out because you are all interested in conservation of Front Range and Colorado species in general. These 4 species were known historically in our areas and are no longer living here, at least have not been seen since the 70s and 80s. All right, so who are those species? So these are things that we would be concerned about locally. So these are 3 species that have gone locally extinct, are all low elevation species in Boulder and Larimer counties. These are all species that have lived at these lowest elevations that now have a lot of people living in them. And so these are all heteromyids, the pocket mice and kangaroo rats. So 2 pocket mice and 1 Ord's kangaroo rat have not been seen for a long time and are currently unmanaged and unstudied by Boulder open space and mountain parks. All right, and then there's this last species that has gone extinct locally. It's a peromyscus, so that's the canyon peromyscus, and there's really does not occur where there's a lot of human habitation. It just has not been found since the 70s and 80s, and we checked actually using DNA across our samples out there because we wanted to be sure it was actually missing, and we did not detect it. All right, so how do we know that all the other shifts that I was talking about aren't just land use change? You might be saying, okay, well, Boulder, we've kind of taken over all of the low elevations. Well, so we looked at that. Here is just a description. These are kind of fun pictures, but essentially these are showing all the different habitats that exist, and then the ones that are really heavily developed by humans. And in particular, these reds and pinks, and then these browns, cultivated crops. You can see in the Front Range, the Boulder Transect, the Big Thompson, they're very much at the very bottom of the mountain, a little bit at high elevations, but not as much. And in the San Juans, you can barely see this because in the 4 corners, there aren't a lot of people, but there's a little bit of habitat in there that is human habitation. So essentially we correlated with the amount of human modified habitat at each elevation and tried to see if that was linked to the number of losses of species at those elevations, elevationally or extirpations, and those regions. And in fact, when you do that, there's no relationship between the losses we see on the elevational gradient and only being in those predominantly in those areas. And so overall, obviously, habitat change has an impact on those places and what species live there. But overall, across these elevational gradients, the climate change signal is much stronger. But the other thing I mentioned earlier is that almost all of our sites that we resampled were in conservation areas, protected areas, or conservation easements. So likely had very strong populations protected. All right, so you might be asking why some species are responding and others not, right? And that was our question as well. So that's a whole area our lab works on and this is known across mammals and birds, that studies have shown that some are responding to climate change and others aren't. And this is a dilemma. If we know why some are responding and others aren't, then we can build better predictive models about those that would be more at risk, right? And so we've done several studies for mammals around North America, but we wanted to do this just for our data set as well. And what we found is we looked at lots of different traits that were linked to these different species, and those that responded and those that didn't. And we found that actually the biggest signal for who is responding the most to climate change in Colorado was that if they were cold adapted species, they were more sensitive to temperature change, and those are the species that move to higher elevations. The ones that were like 350 meters shifted upwards. And so how did we come to define this cold adapted species? Essentially, we used 3 different traits. One is across a species geographic range. So this is Zapus princeps, the Western jumping mouse. In brown, this is where it lives. You can see it's half of, or more than half of Colorado, but it goes all the way up almost to Alaska. Has a huge latitudinal range. And here we are in the southern edge of its range. And then in the southern edge of its range, it's mostly in the mountains. And so those are the 3 traits we found, that if we found that species that exhibited things similar to Zapus princeps, that if they occurred across their entire geographic range at high elevations, in their lower elevations, their lower parts of their range, they were in the mountains. And if we studied them at their southern edge of their range, like here in Colorado, those are the species that responded most to climate change. And we linked those things to being cold adapted. All right, but there is a little bit of good news in here, right? Not all species are responding negatively. A few species are actually doing better. And some of these are clearly obvious, right? Like the rock squirrel. If it's getting hotter and drier, that's the niche of the rock squirrel. So it's expanding its range. Others are competitive dominance. The redback vole. This one is doing incredibly well at our high elevations and has expanded a little bit to lower elevations, just higher elevations, but a little bit lower. And some of our most ubiquitous, so the least chipmunk, is also doing really well across Colorado. So they aren't all bad stories, but they are things that are concerning. So you might be asking yourself, why didn't I study large mammals, right? All these charismatic things we love to talk about: bears, elk, bighorn sheep. Well, the reason we didn't is because these species live across almost the whole elevational gradient, right? You can see a black bear in Boulder, you can see a black bear in Niwot Ridge. Similarly for elk and bighorn sheep. So a lot of our biggest mammals will use the entire elevational gradient seasonally, even some of our mid-sized carnivores. And so for studying climate change on elevational gradients, these guys are not the best for asking that question. So we might ask a different climate change metric, say about their population decline or change, or their reproductive behavior changes, for instance. But in this case, we didn't study them. All right, so the overall take-home message today is that mammals in the Front Range and in the San Juans and likely across all of Colorado are shifting to higher elevations. And right, higher elevations, as you know, mountains get less and less area as you go higher. So we're pushing our montane mammals into less and less area at these high elevations. And that's concerning. And it's concerning not just for the mammals themselves, but our future generations that want to be out studying and seeing and enjoying this biodiversity, and they might not get to in a few generations. All right, so obviously this is super alarming, but there's so much that each of us can do, right? And we can all start small. I'm sure everybody in the Audubon Society is already doing many of these things. So it's just taking one step to help and maybe talking to your friends. But of course, right, voting, recycling, using less fossil fuels and embracing solar and alternative energies are going to help us reduce our fossil fuel output. So thank you so much for listening today and being concerned about our flora and fauna in Colorado. I'll take any questions you might have.
We do have a question in the chat. Megan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
So I see Megan's, is she?
It's a question about the data source. Did you use any of the small mammal sampling data from the National Ecological Observatory Network?
Yeah, not a whole lot. When we did this study, so this came out in 2001, and a lot of their data bases were not up and running for the observatory. But as I said before, we had a lot of possible data, and we had to be able to verify the IDs. And so some of those, there's a lot of the neon data sets had species that don't occur in Colorado, for instance. And so some of those specimen localities we weren't sure about. So we didn't always use all available data but some of that, like the neon, wasn't always available when we were looking.
Eric, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I don't have to, but it's right up there. But I'm just curious about, because of the ecosystems themselves, how are the predators being affected of the small mammals?
Yeah, so like I talked about with the bigger mammals, and their predators are mostly, right, of course, like you guys study or watch a lot, are avian, but also mid-sized predators. So long-tailed weasels, we caught quite a few long-tailed weasels, ermine. But yeah, we don't have any evidence about their changes because we weren't able to study them as in detail. They're much harder to trap, so we would have to do a lot more targeted trapping and population estimates on the different predators, which we did not have time to do. Our study actually looked at the other side of things that someone might didn't see it up there. But we actually looked at their food resources. We didn't have historical food resources. We also don't have historical data on the predators, but we could know something about their differences elevationally that could tell us something about where species are living and thriving. So we estimated food resources across all of our sites. Well, there are 32 sites. I showed you those elevational gradients. So we estimated their arthropod food resources across the entire summer. So 90 days of sampling for arthropod abundance, and then also estimates of plant food resources. And we actually found that the diversity of mammals was unrelated to their food resources. So it looks like their distributions are, obviously the populations themselves need enough food resources to live, but it's likely that there's more food resources in many of these places than they're actually using. And so yeah, predators obviously important, food resources, there's lots of different things about the environment that could be influencing their distributions and their shifts. But in this case, the best informative data is shifting in line with temperature.
Thanks.
Can you make any projections on any of these species? I mean, some of them are getting squeezed pretty hard. And so does that let you estimate kind of at what point they will be in danger of extirpation?
Yeah,
I mean, not do that from sort of two big buckets of, pre-1980 and post-1980.
Yeah, so we know a trajectory and we know how big their elevational range is. So you could imagine if they already have a tiny elevational range, that they might get shifted out of that pretty quickly. The problem is, one of the things I mentioned and you saw from that figure of all of their elevational ranges is that they actually have pretty big elevational ranges. So even if they're shifting up by 200 or 300 meters, they still have quite a bit of elevation in there. Although it's not all the same amount, right? That's just showing you elevation, not like how much area is available in that. So yes, things that get shifted to the very highest elevations or a very small portion of their range are just going to have fewer populations. And at times when there's much more variability in weather or climate year to year, they have a higher risk of being extirpated. Predictions are hard to do though, because we just don't have a huge, really, great handle other than a few of these traits on who's most at risk. But you can say, okay, if you're at the very southern tip of species geographic range and they're only at the top of the mountain, those are clearly going to be the ones that are most at risk. Yeah, so Anne asked about pikas, right? So there was a pika study a few years ago by a CU grad student, PhD student, who did resurvey the pikas in the Front Range, even down in and across Colorado, northern New Mexico, and southern Wyoming. And she resurveyed, she went to the actual sites for each, because she was only studying one species. She went back to the sites where they were historically known pre-1980 and resurveyed those sites. And she only found 3 sites that didn't have current populations. And a couple years after that, she went back and they were back. And so pika are doing particularly well, at least for the data we had known about them historically in Colorado, well, in the southern Rockies in general. That's in their elevational range, that's in their sites. Of course, individual populations might not be doing as great depending on the local conditions, but pika are a very specialized species in that they live in these rock piles where there's ice formations under the rock piles. So they can move up and down in that rock pile to get different temperatures over the summer and winter. So they're a very specialized species, but yeah, because they're at high elevations only, they're at risk. They have been shown to be more at risk in the farther west. So the mountains that are drier and hotter, in the Great Basin, in the Sierras, they have shifted upward and they have had local extinctions in the hottest areas, the driest areas, and in some cases, the lowest elevations, but not always. It just depends on kind of the mixture of those. But yeah, pika in general are linked with climate change in mammals, but they're probably not as representative as you might think across mammal diversity, just because they're a unique kind of unique niche.
Could you talk a little bit about being a biologist and working with museum collections? That's not the way most of us think about doing science.
Oh yeah,
A
great
little bit about how you
question.
think of projects that way, or what the
Yeah,
challenges
great
are.
question. Yeah, so I think of museum collections as being, essentially our storehouses of data about how the world was across time, right? And if we are going to ask questions about how things change, we have to know how they were historically. And that data is really hard to come by because most of our, scientific research on ecological things aren't, were not well recorded up until, a few decades before climate change started. And so particularly in the tropics. So we have almost no historical data sets to compare unless they're in museums. And so museums have this storehouse of, obviously someone in 1880 that was trekking through Rocky Mountain National Park or Pikes Peak or the San Juan Mountains, collecting mammals and putting them in museums all over the country, sending them back to the Smithsonian or the Field Museum. They didn't know they were going to be used for climate change research, but now that all of these things are going to be used for that and are being actively used for that, you can go back to and verify the ID. So most of you guys are really interested in birds. So, species ranges have changed, species designations have changed, subspecies have changed. And so if you have the specimen, you can go back and say, oh, I verified that this is actually this species. It wasn't that species. And it really did occur here. And that's a known thing. And then you can build that data and compare it to contemporary data. And it's incredibly powerful. And if we don't protect those museum specimens, then we lose that historical picture. And it's not just for range shifts, like we have a whole set in the museum of eggs, historical egg collections and nest collections across elevational gradients that people studied in the 50s and 60s. And so someone could go back and say, okay, this person studied, such and such. I know that there's American robins, which aren't the most exciting, but they say, the dates that all of those eggs were laid across multiple populations in the 50s, and someone could go back to those sites today and say, how much is that shifted forward with warming temperatures, for instance? And it's, other questions that people could ask, we preserve food contents, so things that are preserved in ethanol, like all of our lizards, you could go back and say, how has their food changed from cool temperatures to warm temperatures? Are they completely shifting their diet? Do they have different distributions of disease, for instance? So there's amazing amounts of data in these collections, and they aren't just dusty collections. They, we're keep adding to them, and so that's going to keep being valuable to our children, our children's children, and their children's children, because the idea of collections is that we're stewards for all future generations. So, all right, I see a question about yellow belly marmots. So yes, yellow belly marmots are hibernators, and a lot of our mammals are hibernators that I talked about today. And in fact, yes, so hibernating mammals, even all of our insects, right, that overwinter, we don't really think about them as hibernators, but they're overwintering in the soil. So when you're out skiing, just think, there's hundreds of thousands of insects that you're skiing over. And they are overwintering just like our hibernating yellow belly marmots. And so, yeah, the important thing about hibernation and for pikas getting through the winter, shrews and voles actually never hibernate. They're active under the snow in the winter. And all of them can be killed by cold temperatures due to climate change, right? Because as we change our amount of snowpack, that snowpack is insulating so that all of those shrews and voles and those things that are hibernating in under the soil, they need that warming insulative layer of the snow when it's really, really cold, because there's this microclimate that they're living in that's slightly warmer, and that's what they're adapted to live in. And if we scour away that snowpack, or just don't have as much snowpack, then they're actually going to be colder in the winter due to warming temperatures, because that insulative layer is gone. So there are studies in Colorado that have shown that marmot hibernation is being impacted by climate change. They're coming out earlier. This is in particular for the research station in Gothic, Colorado. So they've shown that they're coming out of hibernation earlier, they're going into hibernation earlier. On the plus side, at that high elevations where they aren't as affected yet by warming temperatures, they're actually getting fatter because they have a longer time to eat over the summer, put on a really robust fat layer so that they're actually surviving better through the winter. But of course, this populations they're studying there at the highest elevations, and right, so they're not quite, they probably see a really different picture if they were studying hibernation at the edge of the species range at the lower elevations. So that's a good segue to, if there's one population doing well, that's great, but it doesn't mean all of them are experiencing the same conditions. So we have to think about the variability a species exhibits across their elevational range, their geographic range, and then how climate is changing and all of those factors. So, but yeah, luckily marmots are doing well, at least at high elevations in Colorado for hibernation, but not so much at the mid elevations.
Well, Christy, we just really want to thank you. This has been a wonderful talk and really beautifully presented and really enjoyable. Well, sad in some ways, but really wonderful to hear about your work. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being interested in conservation.
Mm-hmm.